Bienvenidos de nuevo a la última jornada del Congreso, donde nuestros ponentes seguirán compartiendo con
Welcome to the last day of the Congress, where we'll keep hearing amazing speakers. We don't want you to forget about our hashtag. Please share it and mention us on social media. Today, the panel regarding tourism, technology, and for diversity will be moderated by Stefan Junstrad. We'll talk about smart cities and universal design to make cities more usable and accessible for the whole of the population. We would like to encourage you to watch it together with the 8 previous ones that we have uploaded through this week. Today, our keynote speaker will be David Baines, director of David Baines Access and co-founder of Global Symbols. Nowadays, he works all over the world, including projects for low and middle-income countries in Africa and South Asia to foster implementation from accessibility and inclusion from politics to practice. And we'll close with a roundtable under the title, The New Scenario on Mobility. David, welcome. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can see my screen. I'm hoping that you can see the slides, which are certainly more important than my face. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. And it's very interesting to me that at this time, as we come out of the pandemic, that we're discussing again the importance of travel, transport, and mobility, and really beginning to understand how the impact when the freedom to travel is more limited. And I think that helps us understand the experience of people with disabilities for many years and the restrictions and limitations under which they've moved in the past. So when I talk today, I want to very much put that into that context and apologize to you first for my lack of Spanish. But what I'd like to do is really to draw upon the research that was done for the EU-funded TRIPS project, where we really began to explore how innovation and emerging and new technologies could impact upon the capacity for people to travel. And that really started by understanding the barriers to travel that people experienced. And these were, we understood that journeys involved a number of stages, from planning to booking to boarding to the experience on board and arriving and departing the destination. And at any one of those stages, a barrier could emerge, and sometimes those were unanticipated. And we understood that some of those barriers were critical and could completely prevent a journey taking place. Others were more disturbing or even irritating and could only be overcome with significant effort. Those that were only annoying or minor still created frustration without disrupting a journey, but cumulatively over time were exhausting. And the technology that we were beginning to bring to bear upon these challenges could be divided into 2 groups. There were those that were assistive technologies that were designed to specifically address the needs of people with a disability. And there were accessible technologies, which were designed to meet the needs of all users, including those with a disability. And this latter group were linked closely to concepts of universal design. And it was drawing upon both of these areas that we began to apply this to the barriers that allowed us to look at how emerging technologies offered new opportunities for the future. And I want to touch upon for a very short moment what some of those technologies are before we start to look at how they were applied. So the first technology which we found to be particularly valuable was wearable technology. wearable technology that was pervasive. It went with us regardless of where we moved to, and it could offer things from alerts and alarms, memory aids, support for safe movement. It supported us in meetings and collaboration, and supported us to have access to information on demand. The second group of technologies perhaps revolved around smart homes, what we sometimes call the Internet of Things. And this gave us independent control of the environment, supported our security and safety, allowed us to log activities, allowed us to link devices one to the other, creating more responsive and personalized environments. And we've seen many of these recently in smart homes, but actually this smart home technology can pervade right across the built environment, connecting us to that environment and from device to device. Linked to that smart home technology was the concept of location-based services. And these include GPS systems, Wi-Fi, beacons, particularly within the indoor environment. And they were critical when we began to plan and use emerging technology, because location, information, and recall, helping us to find our way from location to location, both outdoors and indoors, providing location data in the place that we received, and providing alerts around the location. And those alerts may be offered in real time, and therefore highlighting emerging barriers to travel that otherwise we wouldn't be aware of. One of the most important areas of emerging technology was around artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence really pervaded many of the other suggestions and solutions that were considered. And artificial intelligence can lie underneath the idea of context-aware AT, where our assistive technologies and our accessible technologies are aware of the setting and the environment within which we are, and adapt and conform to that setting to give us a very personalized, individualized experience based not only on our needs, but the setting which we're living in. It was important in terms of predicting needs, anticipating needs. It supported autonomous mobility. And when travel information was complex, content clarification allowed that complex information to be simplified and presented in a way that was easier to understand. And of course, artificial intelligence lies under many of the automated processes that we use for accessibility, ranging from captions on videos to even image recognition and alt text on websites, web pages, and images. But some of these were particularly important to us. The idea of content clarification, of predictive text and context, of automation of accessibility processes and predictive prompts, anticipating our needs and our intentions. When we brought these together with the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we could use that on a number of the barriers and stages of a journey. Other areas that were very important were robotics and drones. And robotics and drones we've seen growing as a result of the pandemic, including ideas of remote presence and telemonitoring, supporting self-care and home care, and adding security. Robotics and drones allows services to be delivered remotely. It allows us to take part in things without needing to physically travel. It certainly supports deliveries. the physical manipulation of objects over distance, and increased self-care, where perhaps the demand on human personal assistance is far less. And perhaps in some ways we've seen the value of such robotics and drones to mean that we need to travel less, such as not being able to shop, where things can be delivered to our homes. But in practice, actually, we're going to look at some examples where robotics and drones have an impact on journey. The next group of emerging technologies that we really looked at, we called enhanced realities. And they were a mixture of virtual reality, a fully artificial environment, an augmented reality, where virtual objects are overlaid upon the real world environment, and what we called mixed reality, where that virtual environment and that augmented overlay were combined with physical objects in the real world. So we had the opportunity to move from full immersion in virtual environments to the real world enhanced with digital objects, and a real world where what we did and moved in the physical environment created change in the virtual and augmented environment. And many of these enhanced or alternative realities have been used to relate to training, but are phenomenally important when we talk about access to information. They're also really important traditionally in the testing and review of products, but perhaps also offer us the opportunity to test and review journeys in advance of making a journey, helping us explore that in augmented and virtual reality to consider the barriers that might emerge for any one individual. But perhaps when we talk about travel and mobility, probably the one area where we have expected to see so much happening has been the growth of autonomous vehicles. And it's interesting that autonomous vehicles take many of the strands that we've discussed, the emerging technologies, and bring them together into a vehicle using images, sensors, the Internet of Things, to really combine this with mapping and navigation data to control what in effect is a drone. Autonomous vehicles are fundamentally drone vehicles that are controlled by artificial intelligence using sensors within the vehicle and within the environment. And when we pull that together, we have the capacity for autonomous vehicles to be used, which may be used by people who otherwise would struggle to travel completely autonomously. So having had a very brief introduction to some of those technologies, and there were others that we looked at, we began to take these technologies and think about how do we apply these to travel, to journey making, and to that chain that takes place within a journey where barriers might emerge. What we did then in applying those technologies is we created a series of design concepts, some of which are very close to being on the market, some perhaps a little bit further away. Some of them are big ideas, disruptive innovations, new ideas that could transform the way in which we make journeys. And some are much smaller and short term and would address the risk of a barrier happening at any one step in the planning and traveling. Both we recognize as being very valuable. To get those, we used a co-design process where we brought together transport operators, engineers, AT specialists, and most importantly, people with disabilities themselves, and drew them from a number of cities right across Europe to consider the barriers that they were aware of, their personal experience of travel, and to think about how these emerging technologies could be applied. And the ideas that people came up with through that co-design process were fascinating. Some of those ideas were relatively simple, and you might recognize them from other settings. One of the ideas was a mobile walkways across a city network, a citywide network of rapid mobile walkways where people can automatically get on and get off safely, which was a system for all travelers, but had benefits for those with disabilities and had a strong sense of inclusivity. And it really did theoretically build upon existing technology found in airports and metro stations, and the users felt it was friendly and straightforward to use. We looked at the added value such systems might have and saw how this was seen in the opportunity to reduce traffic congestion and the associated pollution in cities, creating a healthier and more pleasant environment for all. Once you've stepped on and identified your route, the pathway, the mobile walkway takes you to where you want to go. It's very simple and easy to understand. You could also see how something like a mobile walkway city network could blend and merge with the existing systems of public transport that we have within cities. It also would be very effective regardless of whether you're using a wheelchair or other form of mobility aid, or whether or not you're able to stand and walk independently. We also recognized that one of the challenges that we faced was understanding the restrictions within public transport, that often getting access to information and data when traveling independently could be quite difficult. And many of people in the discussion, particularly those with limited sight and those who found it challenging to read signage, mentioned about the importance and value of spoken information. And where we have onboard information systems currently, they're identified as being extremely useful, including those where information is put quite high on the roof, which can sometimes get blocked from view if you're viewing it from the height of a wheelchair. So spoken information was really important. But the idea of large screens with information, with the capacity to link to that, to have that information read out using, say, a Bluetooth headset, allowed us to offer a much wider range of information during a journey. It could offer more than stop announcements, but could add live information about congestion around a metro station and the surrounding areas, and suggest pointers about the best way to leave the vehicle or station for those with limited mobility, particularly if entrances were congested, or if the area above ground on a metro was difficult to get around at that particular time. Then knowing which route to take out of a station could have large amounts of extra value. One user talked about this as being a little like having audio description for the real world, delivered through a mobile phone to a headset, reducing disturbance to other travelers alongside shared information. Possibly the best example that anybody gave us was simply being told that the station they had planned to leave, that the elevator had stopped working. So rather than getting off and discovering that, they were told to move to the next station along the line, which was actually much quicker and easier for them to get to their desired destination. That was about reducing frustration, that emotional impact when journeys go awry. The third area that we looked at was travel planning apps and the importance of travel planning apps for everyone. One of the things that people with disabilities highlighted to us for travel and mobility was how much extra time it took them to plan a journey. Currently, often information is held in multiple locations, but transforming this into a single process allows planning technologies to reflect a need to be seamless. We understand that applications that plan travel should recognize that barriers to mobility vary from person to person, and that helps us increase autonomy. So travel planning apps that brought together data and analyze that using artificial intelligence, such as access to stations, accessible routes, accessibility on board, and what to do when things go wrong, helps both people with a disability and anyone with additional needs on a journey, which might include second language users, visitors, tourists, and so on, where actually having information laid out simply would make a huge difference. Being connected to the vehicles using the Internet of Things would allow us to show when an accessible vehicle will arrive and the current waiting time. Information about how crowded vehicles are might benefit those who want to avoid congestion, which could include people with autism. And then such an application would make journeys more manageable and comfortable, with less time spent thinking about travel and more time enjoying the journey. And the example we came up with, which was most valued, was applying that information through augmented reality. And this is already being done with people like Google Maps adding live view, where you can add an augmented tier over the camera view on your smartphone and get extra information about the environment around you. But when we merge data from different data sets into that live view, we get information not just about where you can get coffee from, where restaurants are, where the station is, but also whether or not this is the best or right route for you to use according to your needs. Maybe cluttered, maybe congested, maybe noisy. And you can choose the one which is not only accessible, but really matches your own personal preferences. And this idea then took us further into existing technologies, such as wearables, and really increasingly using wearables for payment and access. Already we've seen banks like Barclays introduce wristbands, which you can use for contactless payment, a variety of settings, including buying tickets and getting through barriers at stations. Wearables that allow people who are using it to pay when boarding and communicate to the vehicle that a longer boarding time is required, we're seen as particularly valuable. Bands are already available in some locations, and users are charged as they board and leave, and don't have to deal with the difficulties of accessing kiosks or ticketing systems. Many people reported how inaccessible kiosks and ticketing systems had given them examples of when they missed a journey or even traveled illegally because of unintended booking errors. And having then to make a case and explain how the inaccessibility had created the booking error, and hence they were on the wrong train at the wrong time. A wearable would be linked to an account to improve the payments as we pass a gate or beacon when beginning or ending a journey. But we could actually take that a stage further, where the same wearable also facilitated access to vehicles by opening doors or activating a powered ramp, especially during an emergency. Not having to wait for someone to take these actions for you was seen as making independent and autonomous mobility much more powerful. They're also a way to communicate, alerting the driver or vehicle manager the disabled user is boarding and making them aware of accommodations they should make. Many people explained that when a driver or vehicle manager knew they had people with disabilities on the vehicle, they took much greater care to support them. When they didn't know, they weren't always anticipating needs. So providing information as well as receiving information could be done through the wearable in a non-invasive way. And of course, wearables are things that we're seeing more and more in our daily lives, whether they be things like Apple Watch or whether or not they're just simply fitness trackers. we're all getting used to the idea of having technology that we take with us and which is pervasive and which offers information and data regardless of our location. And these forms of wearable also offer the means of giving control to engage remotely controlled powered ramps to help board vehicles on demand. And this isn't that different to the way in which we can use wearables already to control other devices using the Internet of Things. I can control my mobile phone. I can use my wearable to control the physical environment, turning lights off, lights on. So actually we could use the same form of technology to select a command to deploy a ramp as a vehicle arose, or using location information to recognize that a wheelchair user will be at the next stop and deploying the ramps automatically. System would allow users to access as soon as they neared a door to enable self-boarding and exit, which would offer independence and again just create less reliance on having staff who were trained and knowledgeable to provide assistance. The turnover of staff in transport companies can be quite high, and maintaining their skills and knowledge can be difficult. So anything that can be done to automate that would seem to be perhaps more reliable than people may be. Gradually, we began then to expand our ideas and think about bigger ideas that could benefit people. One of the ideas that we looked at, which was in development from universities, was the use of LiDAR 3D reconstruction. And this is a very interesting technology for when you're moving around, as it uses sensors which are wearable and portable to reconstruct the environment around you. And we can then take that 3D reconstruction and convert that into sound or other formats. So by taking the signal around us, we can identify obstacles, and the traveler can be warned and guided to avoid them. The idea that this was wearable and allowed those who were blind or visually impaired to reconstruct the external environment very precisely and their position in it, including moving objects, was one of the strongest ideas amongst that group. The sense of confidence and safety were shared by many, as this technology seemed to offer a means to navigate through the built environment to access transport safely. It would help with moving between vehicles and disembarking readily and smoothly. Particularly with the growth of things such as bike lanes, which run alongside where vehicles may park to do a drop-off, 3D reconstruction of the environment could be really important in knowing that it is safe to get out of the vehicle because there's not a bike or an e-scooter or any other sort of transport coming towards you at speed from left or right. Our engineers and people with disabilities imagined smart glasses with a sensor and headphones for alerts. The glasses could share what was detected, process the information, and send the alerts and advice to the headphones. Third-party developers could offer extra information based on what the user wanted, needed. There was a commercial opportunity behind these glasses. Again, you could see how this could link with augmented reality, so not only providing alerts, but other information, and in a variety, quite a wide variety of different formats. I mentioned earlier about robotics and drones. And it's interesting, I've seen the opportunity that drones offer in other fields. I was in Bangladesh a few years ago, and we spoke about the problems of deliveries in Bangladesh. I was in a village next to a lake, and over the lake was the hospital, which you needed to go to pick up your medication. It was about half a mile away, directly across the lake. But for about 6 months of the year, the route around the lake was underwater, and it was extremely difficult to get vehicles through. So a drone flying across the lake, delivering medication to the villages, using a PIN number to unlock the drone when it arrived in the village to give people their medication and treatments, was really quite an exciting idea, and dealt with the immediate environmental barriers that were not consistent all year round. And we took this idea of drones and robotics, and we came up with the idea of what we called an assistive buddy. A travel buddy robot was a concept of a robotic device that followed the traveler, carrying luggage, could support you with information and provide support in case you needed to move from one position or vehicle to another. And for the people with disabilities involved in the design, it felt both futuristic and really quite feasible, with value to people with disabilities, but also to lone and older travelers with bags who might feel overwhelmed as they have traveled. It added a level of confidence and security to the journey, and even a social aspect of not feeling isolated while traveling, and might enable them to walk home freely after traveling, shopping, or starting or ending a long journey. And these don't have to be personal. These can be shared resources. And the sort of design of robot that we had, these small vehicles that we are actually based on robots being used in the town where I live to deliver shopping directly into people's homes. We have these small robots, which have probably come up to about just above knee high, have 6 wheels, and our local shops during the pandemic and beyond put shopping into them when you order it, and they're delivered automatically to the front door of people. By being a shared resource, they support the notion of mobility as a service. Because when you decided you wanted to go shopping, you could book such a buddy in advance on a pay-as-you-go model, which then allows the robot to return to a charging station after use. So rather than straggling with heavy bags or needing to book an expensive taxi, you could still walk to the shops nearby and use the robot to follow you home based on being tagged onto a wearable you might be wearing. It would follow you precisely until you got back. You signed it off at the end of that journey and it returned to be charged for the next user. You could see how that could be used in large airports and other settings where carrying heavy items or just carrying items through crowds could be made a lot easier. So assistive buddies were a really quite nice idea. And such robotics and drones then took us into this idea of autonomous vehicles and taxis. If you go to Heathrow Airport and you travel at Terminal 5, there are autonomous vehicles that take you from the airport to one of the large car parks. You simply walk down, you get in, you just tell it where you want to go, and following a fairly broad routeway, it drives you there and drops you off. And autonomous smart cars without a driver could be rented for personal use. They can be tailored to an individual's needs by establishing a user profile that's engaged when the user enters the vehicle through voice recognition. So, for instance, it could know the person entering the vehicle is deaf, and therefore all information needs to be provided on their smartphone visually. Or it could be that the person entering is blind, and therefore we need to give them the information about the journey through an audio signal. Or that the person has mobility needs, and when we open the doors to let them out, we will know that we need to give them longer to leave the vehicle. Linking these up reduces dependency on drivers, and shared transport seems to be a really good way of offering independence and greater autonomy of persons with disabilities when traveling. Because they're shared and they're booked on demand, They don't require perhaps quite so much advanced planning, and certainly don't require you to find a driver, both collect you and pick you up. They build very much on the model of things like Uber for on-demand services. There was a feeling that for many people, it could make a journey both functional and a pleasure, as they were less concerned and worried about the transport form they were taking. Such autonomous vehicles and taxis are already being tested and trialed in some places, and we're seeing such autonomous vehicles being introduced on things like university campuses. And there's another, of course, really interesting dimension to this, that all the emerging technologies that blend into this autonomous vehicle can actually also be applied to things like autonomous wheelchairs, reducing for the risk of journey making for people in a powered chair who have limited control over the controls on the vehicle, on the chair, and taking away some of that risk. And the other really big idea that people had, we talked about why is it that so many parts of the built environment are still not fully accessible to people who are wheelchair users. And we thought about the drones model. And yes, we came up with a flying or levitating wheelchair. And yet, originally, my first thought on this one when I saw this design was this was fantasy. It was science fiction. But then we began to look at the use of drones for carrying heavy loads a few inches or a few feet above the ground on building sites, construction, and other locations. And once we know that that is possible, and we know that autonomous vehicles are possible, things become quite interesting. Because vehicles that fly at very low altitude can help us to avoid traffic jams and obstacles, may be particularly effective over short distances where there are single steps or small numbers of steps. They might avoid the need for any other means of transport for power chair users, as it could pretty much go anywhere and provide complete autonomy. And as I say, whilst it seemed to be fantasy, it's rooted in actually very realistic engineering. And that included flying delivery vehicles being trialed in some parts of the world. And it seemed to be to support the opportunity to go anywhere and be flexible whilst avoiding obstacles. Clearly, there are many barriers to overcome. A need for some parts, the vehicle to act autonomously to ensure that there was safety and protection for travellers and those around them. But it seemed likely that in the not too distant future, perhaps some of these prototypes will emerge onto the market. Certainly within even my life. So we took these concepts, and this was just some of the concepts that people came up with, that use those emerging technologies at either that small or large scale, and then working with policymakers and transport companies, began to draw up a list of what were the barriers to implementation. Because it wasn't simply the engineering or design that was the barrier, there were other factors that needed to be brought to bear. The first, and perhaps that's why we're talking today, was awareness that many of the innovations that we've talked about are technically and economically feasible. But many of the key stakeholders lacked awareness of the challenge and the potential resolutions. How do we mitigate some of these barriers to design and implementation and make them useful for people? Without knowing what was possible and the potential impact, it's very difficult for bodies to act. Information about what was available was often only available in technical journals and often only in English. For some of the places that would most benefit from some of these innovations, access to that information was more difficult. So making resources and ideas widely available and accessible helps stimulate awareness. As we stimulate awareness, we create more positive attitudes towards change and innovation. which makes those changes more likely in the future. The second area that many people talked about was many of the designs are perceived as being expensive. But we realized as we looked at the analysis more carefully that cost was offset by a number of savings. There was less dependency on human labor. The environmental savings were significant. And this came with increased usage. And of course, the extent to which the innovations used existing technologies impacted on cost. So the underlying technology trends, such as wearables, such as drones, much of the development cost has already been done. We're now into implementation and designing for a particular user case. And we really needed to understand the extent to which the innovation brought comprehensive benefits to all travelers, because this reduced the cost per user. It made it much less that accommodating needs was a financial burden for what was perceived as a small group of users, but instead included them in the total cost to benefit all travelers, making the cost per disabled user no greater than it was for anyone else. So there are a number of ways in which we could understand and mitigate cost, and understanding that broader dimension of cost-benefit analysis and the savings that we would make, as well as the expenses we would incur, was very, very important in future planning. Political will was the next dimension of barrier to implementation. Everybody around the table felt that investment would only occur if inclusive mobility and the community recognized the benefits, and that those benefits and those communities had political and social support. And that meant support from the wider community within which people with disabilities live. One of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be talking here is to recognize the role of disabled persons organizations goes beyond making politicians aware of the need and even of the solutions, but really includes a persuasive business case. Really making it clear how this helps us meet not only our commitments to people with disabilities, but perhaps some of the commitments made at things like COP26 and elsewhere as well. And with that really came being clear and sharing perceptions of added value. And this was challenging because it was a double-edged sword. The extent to which designs offered added value needed to be understood quite carefully. How far a solution made travel easier, more comfortable, safer or faster, added weight to the case for implementation. And of course, added value such as reducing congestion, environmental impact, and safety were highly regarded and helped us harness the community, the wider community, to bring social pressure for change and investment. But we were also conscious that measuring innovations through added value could detract from the focus of enhancing and increasing mobility for those with disabilities. And that had the risk that perhaps we invested in solutions that failed to address the central challenges that people with disabilities faced. And whilst there might be some incremental improvement, reduction in frustration, the underlying challenge and barrier that people faced was not addressed, and there was no real substantive change in travel and mobility. And we come back to where we started from. Without inclusive travel and mobility, not only does tourism become impacted, but access to employment, access to education, and access to social and cultural life and the ability to live independently are all reduced. So in taking those added value dimensions and bringing them to bear, it's very, very important that we don't ignore the core purpose of inclusive planning. Technical feasibility did have to be considered. We did encourage our stakeholders to dream, and they found it difficult to dream, to think in the longer term. People with disabilities have faced so many barriers to travel and mobility that it's difficult to think big, to think long term, and instead you tend to focus on what could be done in the very short and quick term. But those were the ideas that were more technically feasible. All of the ideas that were designed and shared addressed barriers, but some could be delivered much more quickly than others. So we had to ensure that we understood which emerging technologies were being leveraged for the design concepts and the extent to which those ideas could be brought to bear quickly. That took time. And one of the things I would really advocate for disabled persons organisations is to try to bring to bear an understanding amongst the people with disabilities and their community about what these emerging technologies are. Yes, to recognise the risks that we face in using these new technologies, but really to encourage a positive approach to understanding what these technologies could do. Disney always used the term to describe the people who created their new rides, Imagineers. And people with disabilities need to bring imagination to the barriers, because imagination of using real and emerging technologies is what leads to implementation and application. It was the most fluid of barriers. Technical feasibility changes every year. Concepts that were science fiction less than a decade ago are in the real world being tested today. So just because something seems unrealistic today doesn't mean that we won't see it in our lifetimes. As we come to an end, I know I want to take a little bit of time to offer you a chance to ask questions and make comments. There were many ideas that came forward through the co-design workshops with all those different stakeholders. They were ideas that were a mixture of big, imaginative, disruptive concepts that could change everything about a journey, and smaller incremental ideas that could remove barriers to one or more stages in that journey. But they share a single purpose. Freedom of travel and mobility should not and does not need to be denied to anyone as a result of disability. And with that thought in mind, I think many of these design concepts can be taken forward in the future. I want to close there because I want to make sure that I've left a little bit of time for questions and comments. If you want to know more, if we run out of time today, do please contact me by email or through various social media, and do have a good look at the tripsproject.eu. There's a much wider range of materials as we go into the final year of that EU-funded project. With that in mind, over for any questions.
Muchísimas gracias, David, porque sí que tenemos
David, we do have some questions from the audience. Let me read them out to you as long as we have time. How will we include the older generations in the use of these travel applications?
I think that's a really good question. But I think part of that falls under this idea that those innovations that impact on the widest community are the ones we will see around us most quickly. So I think that idea of accessible technology that is used by many, many people. For instance, we know that older people are quite taken to wearable technology for things like fall detection, because it makes it very easy. They've taken it to ways of supporting for ambient living and living at home at times when in other when at other times they might have had to go into care homes. So I think the wider we see those new and emerging technologies being applied in daily lives, the more the older generation will embrace that. And it's the use of consumer technology, which I think is really helpful. Many older people have taken to things like Alexa very quickly because they're such a natural interface. You don't have to learn to do very much to use Alexa. If you can speak, you can access information, or you can control your environment. So ease of use is a really important factor in supporting and encouraging older users to benefit from these technologies.
Gracias, David.
Thank you, David. Here's the next question from the Accessible Tourism Network. Great part of technology seems to eliminate workers, for instance, people who work in transport. Have you considered ways to incorporate these people and make travels more safe for everyone? Have you taken this into account for all of them as well?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting challenge. I think what it begins to allow the people who are working with the industry to do is to really focus on providing the quality of interaction that people need. Because if we're taking away some of the more fundamental and basics of travel and journey making, then it means that we can use those people to really enhance the journey for people with disabilities. One of the things that was really interesting, we were talking about the autonomous vehicles, and there was some people in the groups who weren't that keen on the idea of traveling autonomously by yourself in a vehicle. Because traveling on a bus, a tram, a metro, one of the things they got out of that was the social interaction with the people around them. It was a very social setting. So yeah, there were some risks there, but I think at its best, it says, okay, let's stop using our people to deliver a basic level of service. And let's really use them to add that real human quality and warmth to a journey, which perhaps they don't have the time to do for every passenger currently.
Y hablando de expectativas, ¿pueden algunas de estas...
Speaking about expectations, can some of these technologies, such as the self-driving vehicles, create false expectations?
Oh, I'm sure that you're absolutely right. We have to be realistic, and not all of these can be done at once. So I think, one of the things that is really important to do is to think of this as short, medium, and long-term interventions. So the things that we can do quickly and easy. And I think things like the wearables for paying and getting through kiosks and not having those errors, things like the transport planning apps, which bring together the data sets to make planning quicker and easier. Understanding barriers to a journey and communicating that and changing a journey's directions in real time. Actually, things that could be done quite quickly and easily within transport. But you're right, things like the autonomous vehicles are probably longer term. But as I say, things like the assistive buddy for me would have felt like science fiction 2 years ago. But then most days, if I walk out into my town, I will see those robots delivering locally. So all of a sudden, that seems very, very feasible.
For people with reduced mobility, for instance, technologies allow them to do things, but is there a risk? Is this only available for developed countries then?
I think with all new technologies, that is going to be one of the challenges. But I think, and some things, particularly things like the autonomous vehicles, the mechanical things, are maybe particularly problematic in some cases. But the things that involve artificial intelligence, one of the great things about those technologies is that they are so scalable that actually we are seeing, even in low and medium income countries, increased growth of things like smartphone penetration. I was working with refugees a few years ago, and even coming out and fleeing Syria, Iraq, and so on, one of the things that they took with them and guaranteed, and I met them and I saw their smartphones wrapped in sellotape to hold them together, was how crucial that technology was. It was one of the things they most sure they took with them when they ran. So actually those technologies are pervading very widely, and we can use that availability with technology. I think what's more problematic is making sure that we have infrastructure in place so that these signals and so on can be used. But these may actually offer lower cost ways of ensuring inclusion than some of the older traditional approaches, because we've certainly seen that in other areas. For instance, the distribution of Braille books is really expensive. The distribution of digital accessible books that can be read out loud on a Braille reader is much, much cheaper, even in low-income countries. So sometimes, whilst it sounds like it's going to be a lot more expensive, actually the traditional and older technologies are actually really expensive, particularly where they're designed specifically for small groups of people with disabilities, rather than being accessible to all people, including those small groups of people with disabilities.
Y hablando de tecnología
And
asistencial,
talking about assistive technology and accessible technology, is it possible to mistake one for the other?
Oh yeah, and lots of people do. And it's really weird, odd, because it's quite possible for technology to be both. So we've been doing some work recently on smartphones. And here's an interesting conundrum. If you're using a computer and you need a screen reader, then the screen reader being purchased separately from your computer is viewed as an assistive technology. And people will pay for JAWS, or they'll make NVDA accessible, or other screen readers. But if your screen reader is built into your mobile phone, it's an accessibility feature of the phone, not an assistive technology for funding purposes. So we have this real confusion about what is assistive and what's accessible. And I think when we come into design, funding, and provision, over the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to need to move away from thinking about the difference between the two as being around the specification, and actually thinking the critical thing is, do they help the user achieve the task they want to achieve? And if they help us achieve the task or goal, then they should be something that we seek to provide, rather than thinking, no, that's not, we don't provide that because it's an accessibility feature rather than an assistive technology. The purpose should be the driving force. And I think that's just as true for these technologies. When we talk about autonomous vehicles, for instance, the question shouldn't be, is that an assistive technology? But if it's got all of those features, such as audio description and so on in the environment built in, if that helps people with disabilities to move more independently, we should support it as part of a provision for people with disabilities, even though the rest of the population will benefit from it as well.
muchísimas gracias, David, por haber
Thank you so much, David, for being part of this Congress and for providing us with your vision on how well-used technology can eliminate barriers in travel and tourism. During today's pause, we'll see a video regarding the importance of accessibility in culture. We hope you enjoy it.
La accesibilidad a la cultura
Thank you very much.
debe ser entendida en dos vertientes: en el acceso a la cultura por parte de las personas con discapacidad y en la profesionalización de artistas con discapacidad. En los vídeos de hoy veremos dos proyectos: el de la Bienal de Arte Contemporáneo, en el que se organiza una exposición colectiva, accesible en sus contenidos y al espacio físico, con más del 50% de los artistas con discapacidad, el cual cuenta con la colaboración de importantes entidades públicas y privadas relacionadas con el mundo del arte y, gracias a la Fundación 11, también con la discapacidad. Y el documental Únicos, el cual es un conjunto de 12 capítulos en los que se muestra el talento de artistas con discapacidad apadrinados por personalidades del mundo del arte. Cada uno de los capítulos está protagonizado por un artista reconocido y un único con discapacidad, y juntos van descubriendo el motivo de su obra y su experiencia vital. Accessibility to culture must be understood in two ways, in terms of access to culture by people with disabilities and in the professionalization of artists with disabilities. In the videos that are screened today, we will see two projects, one by the Biennial of Contemporary Art, in which a collective exhibition is organized and which is accessible in its contents and the physical space and features more than 50% of its artists having disabilities. It has the collaboration of important public and private entities related to the art world and, thanks to Fundación 11, also to disabilities. And the documentary Únicos, which is told in a set of 12 episodes in which the talent of artists with disabilities sponsored by personalities from the art world is featured. Each of the episodes features a recognized artist and a unique individual with a disability who together discover the reason for their work and life experience.
Del 5 de junio al 16 de septiembre de 2018. Su Majestad, la Reina Doña Sofía, inauguró el pasado 5 de junio de 2018 en Centro Cibeles la 7ª Bienal de Arte Contemporáneo de Fundación 11. Se trata de un proyecto que pretende reconocer y difundir la obra de artistas con algún tipo de discapacidad o de aquellos que encuentran en la discapacidad su inspiración. En la muestra participan 28 artistas, más del 80% con discapacidad, además de artistas consagrados como Chuck Close, Francisco de Goya, Eusebio Sempere, Pepe Espaliu o Paul Klee. La temática de esta edición de la Bienal es grandes genios del arte con discapacidad, a los que la discapacidad no les impidió convertirse en grandes maestros. La reina Doña Sofía estuvo acompañada durante el acto por la alcaldesa del Ayuntamiento de Madrid, Manuela Carmena, por el secretario general de Sanidad y Consumo, José Javier Castro Dieza, y del vicepresidente ejecutivo de Fundación 11, Alberto Durán, con quienes pudo visitar la exposición y conocer el contenido y el origen de las obras que le explicaron los propios artistas que participan en la muestra.
El arte era un vehículo magnífico también para la inclusión laboral de las personas con discapacidad, que los artistas también necesitaban estar presentes en todas aquellas actividades culturales que se celebraran tanto a nivel nacional como internacional. Y por tanto la Bienal era un escaparate, era una forma de apoyarles para que esto fuera así.
Uno de los proyectos que mejor reflejan esa evolución social es precisamente esta Bienal de Arte Contemporáneo de Fundación 11, que este año cumple su 7ª edición.
Así Su Majestad pudo conocer más sobre el proyecto que nació para dar respuesta a la necesidad que tienen las personas con discapacidad de acceder a la cultura de forma normalizada.
En este evento de arte que nosotros nos acercamos a este mundo del arte hace 12 años, con el ánimo de promover también el empleo, promover la vida profesional de aquellas personas con discapacidad que se dedicaran al mundo del arte en sus diferentes variantes. Pero hemos hecho también, o nos ha parecido muy importante, el servirnos del arte, ¿verdad?, para trasladar un mensaje de inclusión social, que es lo nuestro. En el arte no hay discriminación, el arte no discrimina, en el arte hay igualdad. Y este es un año especial para nosotros, el 80 aniversario del Grupo Social 11. Estamos satisfechos de que un niño o una niña ciega con discapacidad hoy en España lo tenga más fácil que hace 80 años.
La muestra se complementa con un programa de actividades paralelas, tanto de formación como de ocio. Talleres, mesas redondas, ciclos de artes escénicas de cine, en los que el eje central es la discapacidad. Tanto la muestra de artes plásticas como las actividades paralelas son accesibles para todos, y todas las sedes están libres de barreras arquitectónicas. Por la tarde se pudo disfrutar de la actuación del músico ciego Gladstone Galliza, mientras se visitaba la exposición. La muestra está abierta al público en Centro Cibeles del 5 de junio al 16 de septiembre de 2018.
Vamos acabar com samba, madame não gosta que ninguém sambe, vive dizendo que samba é vexame.
Bien. ¿Qué? Mira, intentamos el bolerillo ese muy bonito, ¿eh?
Yo le exijo al cuadro un calambrazo. O sea, el momento del acabado es cuando te pega una descarga. Y realmente es cuando te toca a ti algo. Puedes pensar en el espectador, en no sé qué, en lo que lo va a ver. Pero al final el espectador más importante es tú.
Una persona, ella de por sí es una parte del mundo. Entonces, esa persona puede conectarse con el mundo a través de su obra.
Quizás siempre algo que se ha mantenido siempre es un poco el mensaje o la intención, ¿no? Que siempre transmitir algo positivo, ¿no? Un mensaje positivo que le pueda llegar a la gente y de algún modo le inspire.
Me prefiero considerar como una artesana de las emociones y de la imaginación, ¿sabes? Porque esto sigue siendo una artesanía, esto no lo hace una máquina, esto lo hace mi mano y mi mente, no hay nada más.
Es la semilla, pero a partir de la semilla, que es como el motor, no sabes lo que va a pasar después, ¿no? Y hay que estar abierta o abierto para dejar que eso pase, porque lo que pasa es más interesante que lo que tú tenías pensado.
Le pongo o zoom, cerca o poco lejos. Distancia. Así, a mí me encanta sacar los fotos a todos. A mí me gusta acercar a la gente que pasea.
El descubrir la fotografía fue una sorpresa. Yo recuerdo que compré una cámara sin ningún tipo de pretensión y simplemente por salir a hacer fotografías por ahí.
Aprendí de equivocarme, eso es lo más importante, ¿no? Yo me equivocaba y aprendía de mis equivocaciones, ¿no? De fallos enormes que teníamos al principio, ¿no? Fotografió mi vida, mi vida y dónde me muevo, con quién me muevo, dónde estoy, qué es lo que vivo. En realidad yo soy flamenco, yo en casa yo me levanto flamenco, me acuesto flamenco y a mí eso no me lo puede discutir nadie. Porque yo soy así y es lo que he visto y lo que he vivido.
La música me servía para tantos momentos de plenitud o de exaltación, irme al piano y desfogarme.
Yo creo que arte es todo, es la vida, es la muerte, es la sonrisa, es la alegría, es la tristeza, lo es todo.
Transmitía un poco un lema de vida, que era, si te mueves tú, el mundo se mueve contigo, y si la vida te va sobre ruedas, ¿por qué no bailas?
Vivía con mis abuelos y bueno, pues la verdad es que no había mucha influencia musical en mi casa, pero a mí me volvía loco la música desde pequeño.
La persona que tenga mi disco en su mano me va a tener a mí, o sea, va a tener una parte de mí muy grande.
Seguramente que todo el mundo de la infancia que uno no capta inicialmente su significado, es después, curiosamente, una de las mayores inspiraciones, son los mayores alimentos del artista.
Yo no me veía como actor porque nunca, yo desde el pequeño teatro, de pequeño hasta la sombra puede decir, va un enorme techo.
El arte es como un escape, digamos, a la libertad de expresión. El arte es el que te hace soñar.
Bailar lo bello de las palabras y cantarla también, a través de la lengua del signo.
Hay una frase de Duchamp que ya lo define todo. Arte es lo que cada uno decide considerar como arte. Y a mí esa frase me encanta.
Mi idea es, digamos, escribir poesía y yo la hago como la vivo, como la siento.
Contar algo que toca a todos, que va directamente, casi, ¿no?, que se expresa con el alma y que lo reciben por el corazón.
Para crear, más bien es necesario haber vivido un poco. Y vivir es sufrir, es estar contento, es estar de mil estados de ánimo.
El diseñador tiene que mirar las cosas, cada trabajo, como si no supiera nada, como si nadie hubiera pensado sobre ello y llegando a la esencia. O sea, no mirar como si fuera la primera vez que ves algo en tu vida.
El lenguaje es un juguete cargado de polvo. Es decir, el lenguaje es un elemento gratuito y que podemos jugar con él hasta el infinito.
Monstruo, monstruo, eres un monstruo. Monstruo, eres un monstruo. A la primera, sin enseñar, sin nada,
Para cerrar la jornada y el programa del Congreso nos vamos al transporte, pero esta vez visto desde el punto de vista de la movilidad de las personas y donde la tecnología vuelve a ser la llave de la inclusión. La moderadora de la mesa es Patricia Otero, que actualmente ocupa el cargo de directora de Ilunion Accesibilidad, empresa del grupo Ilunion, líder en materia de consultoría en accesibilidad universal. Patricia lleva más de 20 años liderando diferentes proyectos dentro del grupo Ilunion y concretamente en el sector turístico como directiva de Ilunion Hotels. Bienvenida, Patricia. Patricia, aquí estamos esperándote.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to present this panel. My name is Patricia Otero. I'm the director of Ilunion Accesibilidad. We have 4 guests here, 4 very important people in this field. And we're going to talk about the new scenario of mobility and new technologies for inclusion. So thanks, Alvaro, Maria Jose, Victor, and Jose Luis. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. Now, mobility is one of the great present and future challenges for us. But we have to understand this not only as in a concept of moving through the city, it should also be understood as a tool at the service of all citizens, a tool that allows us to experience things and to take advantage of services. Now, the focus mobility on people brings us to this inclusion that we're all looking for. When we talk about citizens, we're talking about all people without any distinctions whatsoever. Now, with this approach, this human approach of mobility, technology is a great ally. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Alvaro Urech. Alvaro is responsible for innovation at Alstom. He's has a PhD in physics and works in management in different fields of technology like aeronautics, engineering, transport, and innovation. Alvaro now is the director of innovation at Alstom for Spain and Portugal and coordinates these functions with innovation activities. For Alstom, it's very important that each passenger, regardless of their circumstances, can have a good experience in their travels. And we'll see what kind of work is done in this field on a daily basis. So Alvaro, you have the floor. Thanks very much, Patricia, for that. First, thanks for the presentation and for the invitation. For us, it's a great opportunity to be here and participating in this event. It's very important for us. We collaborate with the ONTE Foundation. We have been collaborating with them for a long time now, and we're very, very happy. You're teaching us quite a bit. So we want to take advantage and share everything that we're doing here as well. We're going to, if you could put on my presentation, I'll talk from the slides. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about inclusive mobility. That's the term that we are using in Alstom, which Patricia was explaining. So all passengers, all travelers have the opportunity to have a good experience that meets their needs and their circumstances. Just a few words about Alstom, just in case you don't know our company. We're the biggest manufacturer right now of mobility solutions, collective mobility solutions, mostly trains. In Europe, we're number 2 in the world, 14 billion in revenues, 70,000 employees. So trains are growing now. So we're on the right path, and there we are. We think that these ideas of inclusive mobility are very present in all of the rail projects that we develop. We work in the train cars, high-speed train cars, trams and so forth, and everything in between, and all the systems, aids for the passengers, information and so forth, and what we call also services like maintenance, any additional services that we can add to our equipment once it's delivered. Now, for us, and from my point of view as responsible for innovation, we innovation and sustainability need to go hand in hand. Sustainability from all points of view, not just environmental system, social and economic sustainability as well. And as you can see, the relationship that we have between the different areas of sustainability and the areas of innovation is very direct. So we talk about social innovation, and we have inclusive mobility, mobility for everyone, smart mobility, economic mobility has to make sense, has to be feasible. And here we talk about efficiency, digitization, and so forth. And then green mobility related with the environment. And here we're working on things like clean air, universal design, automation, green traction, eco design, all of these things that we're focusing on. In this case, in today's discussion, we're focusing on healthier mobility and more inclusive mobility as one of our priority areas. Some time ago, we were talking about intelligent or smart mobility and sustainable mobility from an environmental point of view. And now we've added in the recent years, this is for all passengers, the social part, the inclusive part of our work. As Patricia said at the beginning, for us, this change of paradigm is important. In other words, putting the passenger at the center. We used to talk about transport, but this is focused on the system, on the vehicle. But now we focus on the passenger. Passengers are the ones that move, the ones that have needs, the ones that have different ways of operating. So the design from the very beginning has to bear in mind the passengers. Well, that's how it always was, wasn't it? Well, not really. Of course, the passenger was always there, but the way that you think from the point of view of the passenger, so any type of passenger, and all the related needs of passengers is basic when we design our products and services. Now, the design for everyone, universal design, these are the things that we're incorporating in the way we work, because at the end of the day, we all have a certain types of disabilities at certain points in our lives. When it comes to mobility, it could be temporary. Maybe you have a broken leg or something. Or it could be situational. You're not able to, for example, not understanding the language. So you don't know, can't read the signs, for example. You're in another country and people talk about disabilities, but we're always find ourselves in situations where we have deficits. Some people more, some people less. Obviously, there's some people who have permanent disabilities. So what we have to do is design for everyone so that everyone can have the capacity to take that trip without having to do strange things, so that they can just travel just like anyone else. Now, some examples, just very quickly, some of the things that we're doing. Accessibility, we're working a lot on the two level trains, 2 floors. They have advantages, but difficulties for mobility. So we're including, and this is working in some countries already, in elevators on trains, so that the person in a wheelchair can go in, it can go up or down to the top level or the bottom level of the train perfectly well on a platform. Platform accesses, and in Madrid, in collaboration with Avilens. Some of you are probably familiar with that, to provide information for passengers for people who have a visual disability, with their screens, with their phones, with the codes. They can have access to all of that information on their smartphone. And some important projects for us right now, and in both cases we've worked with the ONCE Foundation, and we are developing right now in Spain two important projects, and where these aspects of inclusion and accessibility were absolutely vital and really made a difference for us to have been awarded these projects. In Barcelona, we have visual indications, automatic cameras that detect wheelchairs and know if the space reserved for a wheelchair is taken or not. All of these types of things are integrated now directly in the way that we work. And the other big project that we were awarded here in Spain, there were several, but the biggest one was the new commuter trains, high capacity trains with 2 floors, excessive doors on the platforms, such that during the course of the trip, people with different characteristics can find the best way to enjoy the trip. So that's it. I wanted to be short. I hope that I didn't go on too long. But as Patricia said at the beginning, I just wanted to insist that for us, this collaboration that we have with the ONCE Foundation, this way of seeing things, what they've taught us is how to look at things differently, because sometimes we don't realize, and we are learning a lot. In this collaboration, what we're learning is to look and listen and understand and see that there are things that we thought we were doing correct, but we weren't. But we weren't taking everyone into consideration. So for me, working in these projects with them, these 2 projects especially, has been a fantastic experience. So I'm very appreciative. I'll stop there now. I hope this was interesting for you, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much. Thank you, Alvaro, for that. You talked about inclusion, accessibility, and including everyone in these projects, and this design for everyone. So it's fantastic to see how big corporations offer and design these types of accessible elements and make them inclusive for everyone. Thanks. Now, Maria Jose Aparicio, she's the Deputy Director General of Training and Road Safety Education from the Traffic Department in Spain. She has studied law, and she's belongs to the special school to work on traffic and traffic regulations. She works in driver training and works on safe transport. She's worked professionally in the Director General of Automobile Mobility, and she's going to show us, the situation of mobility and the challenges it's facing, and the projects being carried out in accessibility at the Directorate General for Automobile Mobility. Thanks very much. So again, thanks very much for having invited us, and thanks to the ONCE Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And we've initiated just very recently. We should have started this work probably much sooner, but we are working intensely now on accessibility, collaborating with the ONCE. And for me, It's a pleasure to be here.
Como has dicho, primero me
As you said,
gustaría
I would
hablar un
like to
poco
first
de la
start by
movilidad
talking
actual y
about
de los grandes
mobility
desafíos
and
que
the big
tenemos
challenges we
en
are facing
movilidad
in
plantear desde
mobility.
sus principales protagonistas. Cuando hablamos de los
When we
problemas
talk
y los
about
desafíos de la movilidad
problems and
actual,
challenges of
nos
current
centramos
mobility, we have to focus
principalmente en las
mainly
ciudades porque,
on
bueno, a día de hoy
cities because
el
today
55% de la población mundial
55% of the
se
world
encuentra
population
actualmente en
is
núcleos urbanos y
living
esto no
in
para que
urban
siga
centers,
creciendo.
and this is growing.
Y
This
todos los
percentage is
trabajos que
growing.
se están
And
dirigiendo
all
actualmente
the
están
work that we're
enfocados
doing is focused
principalmente, como digo, en la
mostly
movilidad en el seno de
on
las ciudades.
mobility in
Estamos trabajando
cities.
para
We're
conseguir redes
working.
como la que se plantea en esta imagen, que sale mucho en todos los foros de movilidad del futuro.
This picture
Ciudades
you see
limpias,
here,
amables,
where you
organizadas,
see organized,
con un índice de emisiones
organized,
de
clean
CO2 bajo,
city,
que tenga resueltos los problemas de aparcamiento, de
no
accesibilidad.
parking
Pero
problems.
la
This is what
realidad
we
que tenemos ahora
aspire
mismo
towards,
es
but
otra,
the
y es
reality is
con la que
quite
tenemos que
different.
enfrentarnos
That
las
this
ciudades
is the
a día de
challenge
hoy
that
se
we're
están
facing,
convirtiendo
and
en
cities are
territorios
becoming
complicados
very
para la
complicated areas
movilidad
for
debido
mobility,
principalmente a los
mainly
cambios
due
que se están produciendo en los
to
núcleos urbanos con los nuevos sistemas de movilidad. Y todo esto está
different
produciendo
changes cities are
que la
undergoing.
siniestralidad en
So,
nuestras ciudades sea
and
muy elevada.
accidents are there's also a
Según
high
datos del
rate of
2020,
accidents
datos
in
del
cities.
2020
These
del
are some
informe
data from
Estratos,
2020, a strange year, really,
son
but
porcentajes que
these
se
are
repiten.
percentages that
A día
are
de hoy,
repeated today
de los fallecidos en vías
of
urbanas, el
deaths
80%, es
in
decir, 8 de cada 10 personas
on
que
roads.
fallecen en nuestras ciudades son lo que llamamos personas vulnerables,
80% are
personas
what
que
we
no van
call vulnerable
protegidas
people who are
por
not
vías interiores
protected
seguras.
by
Los
the
motoristas, que han
body of a
sido
car,
clásicos víctimas de la siniestralidad, ciclistas,
by
peatones,
cyclists,
usuarios de vehículos de movilidad personal. 8 de
pedestrians,
cada
and
10
so forth.
fallecidos en nuestras ciudades están dentro de este colectivo. Un colectivo al que
Now,
denominamos
this is a group that we
vulnerables,
call
pero que
vulnerable,
realmente
but
no lo son en
really,
esencia. Un
they're
peatón
not
no se levanta
essentially
por nacer como
vulnerable.
vulnerable.
They're not vulnerable when they get up
Es
in the
la
morning,
propia
but it's the
circunstancia de la ciudad, el
circumstances of the
tráfico de la
city
movilidad,
because of
el
the
que les está
traffic that makes
vulnerabilizando. Y por
these
eso
people
ahí
vulnerable.
tenemos nuestro primer
So that's
desafío.
the
Si
first
queremos
challenge.
conseguir
If we
esa
want
movilidad del
to,
futuro, entre otras
when we
cosas,
think
que tiene que
about
ser
future
segura,
mobility, it has to be
necesitamos
safe.
enfocar
We
todas
have to
nuestras
focus
políticas en
all
la
of our
protección de los
policies on
usuarios
protecting
vulnerables. Dentro de
vulnerable
estos usuarios
people.
vulnerables hay grados.
And there are
Obviamente,
different
uno
grades
de
of
alta o de
vulnerability.
mediana
So we have
edad
a
que
pedestrian, a
tenga
middle-aged pedestrian
todas sus
with
capacidades
all of his or her
importante y un nivel cultural y
capacities.
educativo que un niño
And
pequeño,
it's not the same as
sano
a
y de
small
origen
child,
de
as an
capacidad
elderly
social, por
person,
ejemplo.
or with a
Y
blind
además en
person.
nuestras ciudades
And
estamos
also,
experimentando
we're seeing
también
in the
un problema
cities,
de falta
we
de
have a problem
convivencia.
of a
Son
lack
muchos los ayuntamientos que están
of
realizando verdaderos esfuerzos
social
por
harmony.
crear espacios, por
Uh,
crear carriles bici, por ampliar las
uh,
aceras, pero vemos que esas aceras que se han
the use of
intentado
the
ampliar
sidewalks, for
están siendo
example, the
invadidas por
use of
todo tipo de
bicycles,
cacharrería
the
que
lack
no
of
solo
bike lanes.
dificultan
And
a
this
una
makes it
silla de ruedas
difficult,
el
not only
tránsito,
difficult
también
for a
dificultan a
wheelchair,
un carrito gemelar, a una persona que vaya
but it also
con
makes it
muletas,
difficult
pues como decía antes Álvaro, ya
for
tiene un
for
accidente
just
en un
about
momento
anyone
determinado.
to
Se
move.
están creando carriles bicis que son
Bike lanes are being
invadidos por
built,
vehículos de cuatro
but are
ruedas.
being
Tenemos una verdadera
invaded
falta de
by
convivencia. Tenemos que
cars. So
crear esos
we have to
espacios, pero
create
también tenemos
these
que enseñar a la
spaces, but we have
ciudadanía
to
y concienciar de que esos
teach and raise
espacios deben ser
awareness of people
respetados.
that we need to
Y
respect
por
these
último,
areas. And lastly,
los que nos dedicamos a esto
those
de
that
la
work
movilidad,
on
siempre estamos
mobility,
hablando de
we're
movilidad, las
always
tres
talking about
S, las
the
famosas tres
three
S. Tiene que ser
S's. It
segura,
has to
tiene que
be
ser estable y
safe, it
tiene que
has
ser
to be
sostenible.
sustainable.
Fenomenal, tiene que ser esas tres S, pero aunque solo sea por el
And
orden
that's true,
alfabético,
but
antes tiene que ser
has to
accesible.
first be
La
accessible.
accesibilidad
Accessibility
no es algo que exija
is not
unas grandes inversiones,
something that
que
requires
exija
huge
privacidad de los
investment,
derechos. La accesibilidad
or
no es otra cosa que
accessibility is
permitir que
simply
todos los
saying that
ciudadanos,
all
independientemente de
citizens,
su condición,
irrespective of
puedan
their
elegir
condition,
desplazarse y participar en
should
esa
be able
vida
to
urbana
move within
en
the urban
igualdad de
setting
condiciones.
under
Cuando
equal
hablamos de accesibilidad,
conditions. When
muchas
we're
veces
talking about accessibility, often
humanamente,
we
pues
think
ese 10%
about that
aproximadamente de
10% of
personas que
people
tienen una
who
discapacidad
have
reconocida,
a disability.
pero en la
But
accesibilidad también está
accessibility
recogido
also also means the elderly, for example. In our population now, 19.5% of people are over age 65. So this aging population in our country, in Spain, where we have it really affects a huge number, a huge percentage of the population. And then we also have any of us can have a specific need at any point in our life. So we have to work to guarantee this accessibility for everyone. Now, after looking at these three big challenges in terms of the protection of vulnerable people, accessibility, and so forth, here the DG for traffic is trying to improve accessibility because having a driver's license for many people is the only way that they can move and this is what we need to guarantee. So we have a lot of technological development systems to help drivers, medical advances that allow us to move forward with this. Here, what we do, we're the ones who who test drivers and award driving license. So each driver has to have the necessary skills and capacities to be able to be given a driving license. So we have to work on improving the services that we provide so people with disabilities or specific needs can also get a driving license. This is all regulated in a regulation with the minimum things that we need to be able to drive. This standard has to, like I said before, a lot of advances have been made. So this standard is, it does have to change. For example, access to become a truck driver, for example, used to be limited so that a person with motor disabilities could not drive a truck. But now, after prior analysis and medical reports and medical examinations and so forth, they can. We're also opening things up to group 2 for other people with other disabilities. So we are protecting safety, but at the same time, we're adapting all our regulations to provide access to certain groups that used to not be able to get certain driving license. In terms of knowledge, we would give people with different difficulties more time to do the driving examination, the theoretical part of the examination. For example, we have a whole manual that has been translated into sign language so that people can study all of the things they need to know to pass their driving exam. We also, on our webpage, we have videos that explain in sign language how the examination works, but that's not enough. We're working to adapt all of our questions, 16,000 questions that we have on our exams, our theoretical exams for your driving license. We have things that became very useful for people with intellectual disabilities, and not only for them, but there are also other groups that have learning difficulties or challenges that that can really benefit from this different information that we're providing. Now, if we focus on the actual driving test, well, we have a little bit of a debt to pay with people with disabilities. We have on the web page, we have a specific section with information, the possibility of through the ONCE will now allow vehicles will be able to drive on the roads that that are special vehicles approved by the associations like the ONCE Foundation. So for people with dyslexia, people with disabilities, etc. And we have our project. I'm finishing up because I can see that I'm running out of time. We have we want to take advantage of the technological advances being made to create specific centers to assess people with disabilities to give them greater security and safety when they adapt their vehicles to their disability. Today, this is just done with a medical report, and these are very expensive adaptations, and we're working in collaboration with the Inserso organization to provide simulators and so forth to provide security for adaptation of vehicles. And that's it. I wanted to finish in time, and I could be talking about this for hours, but thanks very much. And I'll answer your questions.
Fenomenal, María José. Pues gracias. La verdad que ojalá podamos disfrutar de esas ciudades del futuro limpias, organizadas, de disfrutar de esa movilidad del futuro. Qué importante es que ya estamos poniendo en marcha mucho trabajo y qué importante es ver que la tecnología sí que nos ayuda, ¿no?, a avanzar más rápido. Y gracias también por tener en cuenta esa formación e información para las personas con algún tipo de discapacidad.
Thank you for taking into account information for people with disabilities who want to access having a driver's license, and we must provide them with the means to get it. And now is the turn for Victor Calzadilla, who works for the Ministry of Industry and Tourism. He is an industrial engineer by University Carlos III. He began his career in the energy sector, working in several tasks related to energy management. He is a state engineer. He works in the General Secretary of the Ministry of Industry. He's going to briefly introduce, because this is a very big scope regarding the new requisites for the installation of acoustic alarm systems. Thank you, Patricia. I wanted to thank the ONCE Foundation for inviting me on behalf of the Ministry of Industry to participate in this forum. I think this type of meetings where there are companies, administrations, and foundations are wonderful in order to move forward into a path that is going to, a journey that is going to be long. There's a long way ahead of us to improve, to achieve real inclusion for everyone during all stages of their life. Having said that, I would like to talk about the more practical issues regarding the design of the vehicles so that they're accessible for all. From the side of traffic management and from industry regarding the requirements to increase safety in the vehicles, especially we provide certification for wheel vehicles, no trains or no planes, only vehicles with wheels. During the design phase of a vehicle, a producer needs to take several things into account: design, industrial property, autonomy, that seem to be solved, but given the apparition of new technologies are becoming again a challenge for producers, for manufacturers. Usability, so that they're accessible for all users and attractive to consumers. There's something we tend to forget. Can it be sold? Does it comply with standardized requirements? The manufacturers are concerned with their vehicles being accessible and safe, but there are minimal requirements that are considered in the legislation, so that even the cheapest vehicle fulfills those requirements. These requirements are considered necessary to provide traffic safety. There are 3 levels where these requirements are collected within the United Nations, European Union, and Spanish legislation. Local legislation will include both Europe and Spain. For the last few years, most of our legislation comes from Europe. As we belong to the European Union, we are part of the drafting of this legislation as well. I wanted to explain the concept of certification that often is not very clear. Certification has to comply with certain requirements that are both regarded to safety and environmental issues. This is a certification by a public administration that the prototype of a product complies with the standardized technical requirements. The fact that this public administration exists is the reminder of a process quite different from the one that was used in the 70s. A different organism is charged with certifying the certification. There is both, as I mentioned before, there are 3 types of regulation: international, national, and European. You can see it on this slide. There's a general procedure for safety. Many of the safety requirements are already there in most vehicles. For instance, emergency braking. Well, this new regulation will make such features compulsory for all types of vehicles. From 2024 onwards, when we buy even the most basic car model, will have certain safety features that are not only present in better vehicles. One of the environmental requirements is the sound level. Traditionally, the sound level of vehicles was a problem. The regulation wanted to reduce the sound level. When we have new electrical vehicles, we have realized that now the sound level of the vehicles that used to be excessive at certain levels is advantage for their safety. For instance, in urban areas where speed is quite low, and the noise that the car makes is too low. In the case of partially electric vehicles, the fact that there's no sound makes that those vulnerable users of the streets, not not only those with visual disability,
se haya generado no se pueda generar, si no se ataja adecuadamente, un nuevo riesgo que no estaba previsto y que
there's a new risk, meaning that if they cannot hear the vehicle coming, it can be dangerous for them to be run over the vehicle. They won't be able to realize that it's coming.
Para los Estados miembros, es decir,
the European regulation states minimum and maximum requirements for member states.
Un Estado miembro como España no puede imponer o no puede regular unos requisitos superiores. Y por el otro lado, España como Estado miembro ha cedido parte de su soberanía a la Unión Europea.
Spain as a sovereign, as a member state, has to comply with the requirements agreed by with the other member states of the European Union.
Como decía antes, uno de los requisitos ha sido el nivel sonoro, que tradicionalmente ha sido
As I mentioned before,
encaminado a reducir el nivel sonoro de los vehículos.
The sound level was usually considered as something that needed to be limited. But because of this new threat of the noise being too low, now it was needed to introduce in the certification legislation new requirements for electrical vehicles
tengan un sistema de avisador acústico
to have
cuando circulan a bajas velocidades.
An alarm system when they're at low speeds.
Por los neumáticos, por la interacción de los mismos con la calzada, no es suficiente para que pueda alertar al resto de usuarios de la vía.
So this acoustic warning will be able to alert users of the road or the street. As I said, at the latest, in July 1st, 2021, all of the manufacturers of electrical vehicles or hybrid vehicles will need to provide this acoustic warning signal. What are the features? Each and every one of this category of vehicles should provide this acoustic warning up to 20 kilometers per hour and during reverse. There are certain vehicles that need a combustion engine to function, since the combustion engine makes an easily identifiable sound by pedestrians and other users of the road, then in that case it's not needed to install this acoustic warning. The sound should be continuous. It must provide a similar sound to when cars speed or decrease their speed. They should be as easily identifiable as combustion engine vehicles are currently. And finally, so you can get an idea of the sound level, currently we're at 50 decibels and the acoustic warning system, and the maximum level for the sound of combustion engine is 72 decibels. So this is this acoustic warning is high enough, but is not bothersome. With this, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you so much. I know it's quite a complex topic and maybe difficult to understand for someone who is not working on a daily basis. Sometimes it's even complicated for us and the manufacturers that work together with us. But I hope with this brief presentation, you at least got a general understanding on how during the elaboration of the technical requirements of the vehicle, it needs to be taken into account the evolution of the features and how such a technological jump ahead amounts to a need to change the legislation. Thank you, Victor. Quite often, such technical issues are difficult to understand. It's quite important when we design products and services. What is good for people with disabilities is good for everyone. It improves goods and services if we take into account the needs of people with certain disabilities. So thank you, Victor, for your presentation. I think we're doing great regarding timing, so thank you all. I would like to welcome Jose Luis. He's an architect by Politécnica University in Madrid. He has a wide experience on disability, over 20 years. He has worked in several stages within the ONCE, in all of its different scopes. He has worked as a consultant in different companies. He has worked in several projects. I won't have time to mention all of them. Smart human cities at national and international level. He's going to talk about safety in our cities, road safety in our cities. You have the floor. Thank you so much, Patricia, for the introduction. It's wonderful to listen to all of you, to hear a multinational company such as Alstom, as you mentioned before. Well, Albert said that you're learning so much from us. Well, I think it's the other way around. We're learning so much from you. The goal of the traffic directorate is, of course, to take care of people. It's great to listen, to hear how you're offering new and adaptive solutions for people. So we're getting there, is the feeling that I get from hearing all of you. I'm going to focus on what I wanted to tell you about. We're going to talk about a city that can be enjoyed by everyone, an accessible, safe city adapted to the times we're living in, to the new technologies, to new means of transport, etc. I think we need to think about the cities today and about the city of tomorrow. What's new today, tomorrow will be outdated. Before we start thinking about new cities, I would like to share with all of our audience 3 key ideas that we can consider. We have over 1,000 million people with acknowledged disabilities. That amounts to the whole population of China. In 2050, which is basically the day after tomorrow, almost 1/4 of the population will be over 65 years. In our country, this term will be even shorter. And by that very same year, 2050, about 70% of the world population will live in cities. We are seeing in Spain this problem of inhabited Spain, the migration of people from small towns into the cities, and we are going to see this even more often in the next few years. We need to consider cities that will offer solutions to all of these problems, as you do with lodging, urban planning, public buildings, transport and mobility, of course. That smart human city that Patricia mentioned in my introduction. This is a smart city that focuses on people. As Alvaro mentioned at the beginning, it's not the system, it's a traveler who determines the mode of transportation. The new methodologies regarding mobility needs to be done according to people's needs. How are cities planned nowadays? The cities where we all need to move around. Throughout all of the world, we have different types of cities, towns, because of their geography, because of their shape or their age, forces us to move, adapting to what's there. You can see these ramps, these protected floorings. We have cities. For instance, you can see the name of this city in Granada is called Get Out If You Can. Way signing for pedestrians sometimes doesn't make things easier. And for other types of vehicles, this image you can see on the screen can be the access to any large city in the world. There are thousands of different arrows, some going to the stadium, other one points to the IKEA, to McDonald's, to the city center. All of this has an impact on the citizens' mobility. Cities are the way they are. We need to find solutions for them to improve mobility for all citizens. In this example, you can see that within infrastructure, this is a great crosswalk, an accessible street. You see that the management is important. How the inclusion of urban furniture, of the parking spaces, all of this also conditions the accessibility of many people when they need to move around the city. This person that was trying to cross the street in a greatly designed city, now you can barely see them. That vulnerable pedestrian in the face of the vehicle that is coming ahead, we need to take that into account. There's sidewalks that are very well designed with bike lanes outside of the road. All of this needs to be upkeep as well. Here we can see terrible examples of elements that difficult pedestrians' accessibility. We can also see the difficulty from things that are placed on the sidewalks by the shops, by the cafes, urban furniture. All of this shows us terrible examples of how things can go wrong in mobility. I always like to show this image that is very recent. This is a park meter where you basically need to jump to access it. It makes no sense. There are many solutions to bridge this gap between the sidewalk and the park meter. Here we have other examples of excellent practices where pedestrians are protected and can enjoy the sidewalk safely, and also those with disabilities. This also, I really like to show this one. You see this bike lane? The central image, this is a sidewalk for pedestrians, but you can see in the bike lane, there are trees, there are street lamps. It looks like a obstacle race. Well, here we see on the right, all ways take to Rome. Well, here always take to Orense. How are we moving today and how will we move tomorrow? My colleagues were talking about how our city centers looking like. This is downtown Madrid. This is not sustainable, it's not healthy, it's not safe. I think I said once people with disabilities. I'm talking about everyone. We need to make a city that is livable for everyone and also accessible for people with disabilities, but accessible for everyone. We've had several revolutions regarding the Industrial Revolution, new vehicles, vehicles for everyone, and now we have shared vehicles, autonomous vehicles that are about to coexist with us. Also have new mobility vehicles such as scooters and electric bikes, and there's shared vehicles. The electric vehicles that were mentioned in the previous presentation with the warning system. We can see the scooters, how nicely parked they are on the sidewalk. Because what is more normal in our cities is to find this. And this has an impact on mobility, because this prevents a pedestrian from using sidewalks safely. Thankfully, the situation is no longer something that could happen because they are not allowed to be on the sidewalk. Sidewalks are for pedestrians. It's the only safe space left to be protected from vehicles in the city. Well, but there are certain elements that are here to stay. We need to find solutions for them. We cannot kick them out of the cities. In the future, we'll have many other actors in city mobility, such as autonomous vehicles. Some of them are already functioning in different cities all over the world. We need to see how this interaction is going to work between pedestrian, autonomous vehicles. This interaction should be based on the fact that everyone can access information. We have drones. I think there are drone taxis already in Dubai, for instance.
And here, we have to always keep the needs of all travelers in mind. And just a few ideas here to when we talk about mobility and pedestrians is we're talking about everybody here. You know, regardless of all the public administrations, the cities, the governments, and so forth, to see how to modify mobility towards a more sustainable system. The key thing is that the best movement in the city is the one that doesn't happen. In other words, people should only travel in the cities when they really have to. See, city planners have to see mobility as an important element in the planning of cities. So mobility needs to be combined with new models, new lifestyles, and the design for everyone. All people have to use cities. All people have to be protected when using these new elements, these innovative solutions in cities. And so we need a good design, which is always accessible, and with the citizens in the center. So thanks very much. I went a little bit over time. I apologize, Patricia, but I'm very happy to answer any of your questions.
Gracias, José Luis.
Thank you, José Luis.
Qué didáctica tu presentación. Gracias, porque la verdad que
Thanks for that presentation. You gave us a lot of examples.
y efectivamente la
And
discapacidad se
yes,
menciona, pero hay que
you talked about disability, but we do need to build for everyone, as you said.
en esto. No sé si hay alguna
I don't know if
pregunta
there are any
del
questions
público, que
from
si
the
alguien me
public
puede
right now. If someone
orientar.
can to tell me if any questions have come in.
Pues muchas gracias,
Well,
Patricia.
thanks very much, Patricia, but I'm afraid that there's no time for questions. Thanks so much for the speakers today and to all of the participants that have been with us today and throughout the Congress. Thank you so much to everyone. We hope that you have the same feeling as I do, that all of this knowledge has enriched us and has an impact on the way we will interact. But to close, I want to give the floor to José Luis Bravo, the representative of accessibility and innovation and responsible for the organization of this whole event. José Luis, we'll see you again in 2023. Well, thanks very much, Sylvia. I'm just going to close this Congress. I could just say, I said that this is officially closed. That's what I said last time. But I want to thank, first of all, thank all of the collaborators that made this 4th edition of the Congress on Technology and Tourism for Diversity possible. Mention them, the Paralympic Committee, the Spanish Paralympic Committee, TERME, the Royal Patronato, the ONTE Social Group, all of the technological collaborators working, PlayStation, Casa Duomo, Smart City.es, for example, and of course the technical team. No one sees all of the people doing all of the technical work, image, people in Boadilla who are doing all of that work, working behind the cameras, the communications team of the ONTE Foundation that has been helping us to disseminate the social networks, all of the details that they have been working on. Special thanks to the Accessibility and Innovation team at the ONTE Foundation, and especially to all of the members. So thank you so much for all the work that you have been doing night and day. Always happy. Never complaining. I really think that I'd like to recognize Antonio Asonia, congratulations on all this work that you've done over the past several months. And nothing else, really. Also, thanks to the public of the audience that has been listening and participating with us this whole week. So thank you very much for your participation. People from around the world supporting us and sharing their initiatives and good practices and visions on accessibility and innovation in tourism. And really nothing else. So on behalf of the ONCE Foundation, and I just heard this morning someone say on happiness at work, and I just really on behalf of the ONCE Foundation, I would like to wish you all the happiness in the world, and that we should try to make others happy, try to make the world a better place, a world that is more inclusive, that is of everyone, that belongs to everyone, and make others happy, and it'll make you much happier as well. So we are here to help everyone to achieve this goal. We'll see you back in 2023. Sylvia, thank you so much for hosting us this whole week. And we'll see you in the 5th edition of the Congress on Diversity in 2023. We hope that we can do this in person and have a beer after the presentations and give each other a hug. So take care and be happy. Thank you.